I want to begin this morning by asking you to think back on a time in your life when something that you had always counted on was suddenly taken away from you. A time when you wondered, how in the world will I get through this? I remember the day, the second year of college, my mother called me one morning and said, "Drew, your grandfather had a heart attack and died this morning." Well, that was rough. My grandfather raised me after my father died when I was 5. I remember the morning my divorce was finalized. It seemed like the end of the world. I remember the night my best friend was diagnosed with terminal lymphoma. With each of those events, one of the great buildings of my life was thrown down. Stones that I had so carefully placed upon which I had built my life no longer stood one upon another. The temples of my world had fallen. My world had changed. My life would be forever different. I want you to think about that because the gospel lesson for this first Sunday of Advent is from Mark 13. And in this chapter, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem and the subsequent plundering of Jerusalem in his comments about the day of his returning. Jesus and his disciples have entered Jerusalem in the last week of his life. And they find themselves standing in front of this magnificent temple there. And he tells them all that in a very short time, this very temple would lie in ruins. It seems to me that we all build temples. Relationships, beliefs, institutions, reputations, dreams. Stone upon stone, we build them with the idea, sometimes spoken, sometimes unconscious, that these great structures will always provide direction and give us meaning and identity and security and value and order to our life. We know that the temple Mark talks about in today's lesson is the temple that King Herod built. But to understand this story, I think you have to know this temple was more than just a building. It was more than just a place of worship. It was the center, it was the anchor of all Jewish life. It provided identity and structure and meaning to that whole community. And the disciples stand there and they're pretty impressed with this building, the large stones. And they draw Jesus' attention to them, and Jesus says, "Do you see this building? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." I suspect each one of you could tell a story about a time your personal temple was destroyed, taken away. Maybe it was your own divorce or the loss of a loved one, or the story about cancer or some other illness that changed your whole life, or the day you became a parent and caretaker to one of your own parents, the time someone betrayed or hurt you, the loss of a job or a business, the realization that your life or the life of someone you love is controlled by addiction or fear or anger or resentment. Or maybe it was the day you recognized your own powerlessness and your lack of control. Beliefs that had sustained you for years suddenly became a rubble of doubts and questions. Regardless of how it comes about, the day our temple falls, we might call the day of our apocalypse. A day when our great buildings are thrown down and not one stone left upon another. For our life and our world has been forever changed. Too often when we hear the word apocalypse, we think of the end of the world. And it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? When you're going through it, the earthquakes shake the foundation. Famine leaves us empty, and denying us any sense of satisfaction. Wars divide and fragment the unity of our life and our relationships. But the gospel teaches that is not the end. Apocalypse is not the end. It's not so much about the end of the world as it is about the end of the many worlds, temples, and great structures that we have created for ourselves. Now look at this scripture. It's the perfect text for the first Sunday of Advent because it's really a scripture about hope in the midst of despair. Knowing he has only a few days left to live, Jesus sits with his disciples there on the Mount of Olives. And they look across the Kidron Valley into this great temple that Herod had built. It was one of the wonders of the world, this temple. People would travel from all over the Mediterranean just to see it. Possibly the greatest of all architectural wonders of the ancient world. Of course, we know that King Herod, who had built this temple, was a megalomaniac. He was a murderer, a paranoid, crazy person. But he built this magnificent temple dedicated to God. You know, the funny thing about some of the greatest churches ever built is that they were holy places, but they were built with unholy money. And sometimes by unholy people. But to the disciples, this building looked utterly solid and impregnable. And then Jesus makes an amazing prediction about Herod's mighty temple. He says, not one stone will be left upon another. Now that seemed impossible to them. But sure enough, within 40 years, not one stone would be left upon another. Because there would be a revolt against Rome. And Titus and Vespasian and all their legions would come to Jerusalem and raze the city and massacre the Jews and dismantle completely this magnificent temple. And what's interesting to me about all of this is what Jesus had to say. He says to the disciples, mark my words. There's going to be a catastrophe, and then there will be another catastrophe. There will be wars and rumors of wars, and there will be earthquakes and other signs, and these years will be terrible years. I want you to imagine if one of our politicians had run on that platform. Folks, the next 4 years are going to be pretty bad. You think the last 4 years were bad, you just wait. It's going to be terrible. Who would vote for such a leader? We expect our leaders to protect us, to say all will be well, but Jesus always tells the truth even when it hurts. He says there will be wars and rumors of wars. There will be catastrophe upon catastrophe. There are two things about what he said that are particularly interesting to me. The first one is this: God does not shelter his people from difficulty. There are some folks who just walk around and they believe, well, if I just pray, if I'm just holy, God's going to protect me physically, and God will shelter me and those whom I love from harm. But we know that's not the case. God doesn't say Jesus will shelter us from it all. In fact, Jesus himself said, you will undergo persecution. God shows us the way through it. God gives it a purpose. But most of all, God wants us to know that's not our final destination. And the other thing Jesus says here, this is amazing to me, and I think we should take great comfort in it. He talks about these catastrophes to come, and after he lists them, he says, these are but the beginnings of the birth pangs. These are but the beginning of the birth pangs. Reminds me of a story Henry Nouwen used to tell. In this story, there are fraternal twins in their mother's womb. Now, you got to work with me on this story just for a minute. There's a little boy and a little girl, and they're in their mother's womb, and they have a conversation one day. I guess they're usually talking about whatever people talk about when they're in the womb, right? One day they have this conversation. The little girl looks at her little brother, and she says, you know, brother, there's something I've been thinking about, and I want to share it with you. He says, what is it? She says, I believe there is life after birth. He says, life after birth? What are you talking about? What's birth? This is a cozy, warm, dark place where we live. It's safe here. Nothing happens. And we cling to the cord that feeds us. Why would you want something else? What are you talking about? And she says, I don't know. I just believe it. That there's a place where there's light and beauty and freedom of movement. He says, who put this idea in your head? Just hush. Now, this really hurts her feelings, so she doesn't say anything for a long, long time. But apparently there's not much else to do in the womb but to think. So she thinks some more, and then she comes and she says, brother, there's something else I believe, and I'm afraid you're not going to like it either. He said, what is it? She said, I believe there's a mother. He said, a mother? Who put that idea in your head? I've never seen a mother. You've never seen a mother. How could there be a mother? This is a fine place. Let's just relax and be content here and make the most of this place. Cling to the cord that feeds us. Why do you think about such things? Well, this really hurts her feelings. Though she doesn't say anything for an extremely long time, and then after a while she can't keep her thoughts to herself, and she says, there's one other thing. And he sighs deeply and says, what is it? She says, have you ever noticed those squeezes, those contractions that we feel every once in a while? He says, yeah, well, they're just part of life here. There are squeezes, and they are painful, and they are uncomfortable, but that's just part of being here where we are. And she says, I believe those squeezes and their painfulness are getting us ready for another place. I believe they're preparing us to go to that place where there will be light and there will be freedom and there will be beauty and where we will see our mother face to face. And he says, I'm just so tired of your babbling. Please keep quiet. Those birth pang squeezes, Jesus says, are preparing us for another place. There are squeezes here. There are pains. There is suffering. But this world is not our final destination, you see. There is another place. There's a place where we will see our Creator face to face. That's the promise. There will be freedom. There will be beauty. There will be much love. You see, when Jesus looks at all the catastrophes to come, what he says to the disciples, I love this. He says, do not be alarmed. Do not be alarmed. You and I, we are masters at being alarmed. We are alarmed over all sorts of possible catastrophes. There are all kinds of things we probably should be alarmed about. Will the economy hold up? What about the massive national debt? Will the news coming out of North Korea or the Middle East, we become alarmed about the possibility of war and nuclear holocaust? Or maybe it's our own personal catastrophes that cause us to be alarmed. Our fill-in-the-blank catastrophes. Whatever it is, Jesus says, do not be alarmed. These are but the beginnings of the birth pangs. You want something to be alarmed about? Consider this. I saw this in the magazine this week. It was an article that caught my eye, and I thought this may be what causes me to be alarmed. This article talks about what I think may be the most dangerous trend in our society, in our culture, the trend toward not caring. The Greeks had a word for it, akadia. We translate it apathy. Not really caring at all. And I recall it was one of the 7 deadly sins, apathy. Nothing seems to be sacred anymore. The article says, we are becoming a people who do not know how to be serious. Or if we are serious, we are whining and complaining. We don't know how to be constructively serious. We're all about being cool or hip or rad. We cynically make fun of ourselves and everybody else. If we believe in anything, we won't believe in it for very long. And so we come to be self-indulgent. There's no such thing as self-sacrifice in such a world. And in the summary, the article says this: in our society, it seems the competition is to see who can care the least. To me, that feels like a catastrophe. Except Jesus says, do not be alarmed. We're here this morning in a church. You might say this is the place of big stones for us. And Jesus and the disciples, they look at the temple with all the big stones. Well, this is a big stone place. And I think Jesus is worried that we too might make a mistake about the big stone place. We will think this is it. We're safe. We're protected. We've got the big stones. We're comfortable. We go to one of the prettiest churches in all of Hohenwald. You can tell the Baptists I said that. I like to needle them every now and then. But we got the big stones. But Jesus says at some point not one stone will be left upon another. It's not about the stones. It's not about the church size or how many members you have. It's not about the bank account. You see, the disciples were impressed with the surface things. We have to be careful. We don't mistake the surface things for the deeper reality. We know one day we'll see God face to face. Well, the church, the whole point of church is to point us beyond this time to the time when Christ will come again in glory. Now, how all this has happened, when is all this going to happen? We don't know. That's where faith comes in. When that day is scheduled to arrive is a question that books and movies and some denominations love to try and answer. But the Bible doesn't. In fact, the Bible really strongly suggests the whole question of when the last days will come is one question we probably shouldn't even be asking. I'm reminded of what Martin Luther used to say whenever one of his students would ask him, what was God doing before he made the world? And Martin Luther would answer by saying, before he made the world, God was making switches to whip people who ask questions like that. Jesus himself said this concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, only the Father knows. It will come when it comes, not a split second sooner or later than God has ordained it from the beginning of the world. Because if you're not careful, you can waste the present preparing for the future. As I've said before, some people are so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. You can spend so much time and attention planning for the future, you never actually get to live in the present. Sometimes we parents can get so wrapped up in preparing for our children's future, working hard, saving money, that we miss the children's present. That can't be right. Jesus says, be on guard, keep awake. Living in the present while waiting on the end is not easy. It requires perseverance and patience and a sturdy faith, and none of this faith in myself or faith in the goodness of humanity. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a living faith that Jesus Christ will come because he has promised to come. So don't worry about it. Let him take care of the universe. You just take care of what he's entrusted you to take care of. That's what that parable at the end of this story is all about. The master goes on a journey and leaves the responsibility to take care of things to his servants until the day he returns. Each with his work, he says. That's our job, you see, to work his will while we wait, to learn how to be grateful for it. Sometimes it takes a shock to teach us what to be grateful for. I remember one Advent, it was a Friday evening several years ago. I received a call late at night to go to Methodist Central Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. It seemed a young couple who had been recently attending our church had had a car wreck. The parents were okay, but their 3-year-old little boy had been injured in the accident. Shortly after I got to the hospital, that child looked terrible, bloody and everything. But after a few hours, the doctor came in and they said, "We have scanned everything and he's pretty bruised up, but he's going to be okay." And the parents were interesting. At that point, they didn't say, "Okay, let's go home." In that moment, they couldn't stop crying. They couldn't stop crying, and I couldn't either. You just hold this little child when 10 minutes before you were worried about all sorts of things, your budget or your Christmas shopping or whatever, all this stuff you think is so important. And if somebody said, "What are you grateful for?" and you answer, "My retirement portfolio," and then you nearly lose your child. And then your child is there, and you hug the little boy, and you know what to be grateful for, don't you? I have this little wooden cross I keep in my desk at home. I'm going to share this and then I'm going to quit. I'm grateful for this cross, but more than that, I'm grateful for the guy who made it for me. He was a very close friend of mine, been about 25 years ago. He was diagnosed with this malignant cancer. They tried to treat it. They couldn't do anything, so they'd sent him home. And he was under hospice care. He had all his life kind of had this hankering to learn how to whittle. So he started whittling. Couldn't get out anymore, so his wife brought him some wood, and he took a knife, and he made his wife a little cross. And then he made one for his daughter, made one for his son, made one for all the people in his disciple Bible study class. And I was like, "I want one." So he made me one. And when I went to pick up my cross, he said he'd been whittling, and I said, "I heard a joke about whittling." He said, "I've never heard a whittling joke." Well, I said, "Well, here it is. There's this city slicker, and he wanted to see what country life was like, so he went way out in the country to see if he could find a country person. Went way down a dirt road, and he saw this guy sitting up on his porch in a rocking chair whittling. He hollered up to him and said, "Hey, mister." He said, "Have you lived here all your life?" And the old fellow up on the porch thought for a minute and finally said, "No, sir, not yet." And I told this dumb whittling joke to this guy who was dying. Think about that. And when I started the joke, he thought it was especially funny. And as he put it, "I'm not dead yet." So while he was still alive, he made these little gifts for people. And I asked him why. He said, "Because I have so much to be grateful for." But really, it's this. It's the cross of Jesus Christ. I'm grateful for my salvation. I'm grateful for hope. I read that article in the magazine that says we're in competition to see who doesn't care. And then I look inside myself, and I'm grateful that I see somebody who cares. This world might not care, but I believe you came to church today because you care. I believe we can still make a difference in this world, in people's lives. I know you believe that. And I believe this church still matters because this is the place where we talk about the cross of Jesus Christ. It's the one place where in the face of catastrophes of the world we can say, "Do not be alarmed." It is the beginning, not the end. It is the beginning of the beginning. It's the beginning of the birth pangs. Sure, there are squeezes and suffering and pain, but they're getting us ready. They're preparing us for a brighter place, a place of beauty, a place where we'll see our Father face to face. So I'm glad. I'm glad I care. I'm glad you care. I'm glad we're the church together, not the building, But you and me, we're the real church. And that there's life that's coming. That's certain. Life dawning around us even now. And for all of this, we give thanks.